So great to be here. You know, Josh is one of the sharpest young leaders, pastors I know. I hope you realize that. And you guys have a great church here. And so three guys were sitting around one night playing poker, and the subject of death came up. And one of them said, "What do you want people to say about you at your funeral?" And the first guy said, "I want them to say I was a brilliant surgeon who saved many lives." And the second guy said, I want people to say that I was a dedicated family man who loved his wife and his kids well. And the third guy said, I want people to say, look, he's moving. Believe it or not, more and more are saying, look, he's moving. As modern medicine resuscitates more and more people from what's called clinical death, where their brainwaves stop, their heart stops beating, and yet they come back to speak something about the life to come. And it's not a casual experience. You know, the Gallup poll found that 1 out of 25 Americans, something like 13 million Americans, have had a near-death experience. Now, I knew nothing about this. I was a skeptic. I didn't know what I believed about God or Jesus or the afterlife when my dad was dying of cancer. And I saw on his bedside table one night the first book on near-death experiences. I picked it up, started reading it, couldn't put it down, read it in one night, and at the end said, oh my gosh, this God stuff may be real. And if so, what could be more important than figuring this out? And that led me on a spiritual journey where the next year I got in a small group Bible study, you know, kind of like what you're doing with outposts and huddles, and I came to faith in Jesus. Now, fast forward, I went from a career in engineering into full-time ministry, into seminary, and I've studied the Bible for the last 30 years, but I've also studied about 1,000 near-death experiences over the last 30 years. And I wrote Imagine Heaven to show how these experiences are like dots of color on the picture of this exhilarating life to come that the Bible's been giving us all along. For two reasons. One, to help skeptics like me realize how real God is and how much he loves us and the wonderful life he has prepared for us. But also for Christians to help us imagine heaven, because Colossians 3:1 tells us, set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth, because that's where your real life is. Now, all of these experiences, though, I hold a little tentatively, because what I've realized is every near-death experience is interpreting something that they have to interpret in their own worldview. But when you look at them across the board, they're reporting the same things, though they may not always interpret them the same way. I kind of look at it like this. Imagine if this life that we're living right now in 3 dimensions, right, of time and space, or 1 dimension of time. Imagine that this is all a flat 2-dimensional screen of black and white. And death means you are separated from your physical body, right? So imagine at death, you're ripped off this flat 2-dimensional screen and you're brought into a 3-dimensional world of color that was all around you all the time, but you didn't know where it was because you didn't even have this dimension. And now you experience this world, and you're able to see your old world for what it was, this flat black and white experience. And then you have to go back into that flat black and white experience and try to describe 3 dimensions and color in flat 2-dimensional black and white terms. How would you do it? That's what I'm convinced these people are doing. Now, today I'm going to let you hear from 4 of the 120 near-death experience stories I tell throughout Imagine Heaven. People who had nothing to gain by making up these crazy stories. A doctor, a surgeon, a tenured college professor, a commercial airline pilot, and a pastor. All they had to gain was to lose credibility. They didn't need the money, and yet listen to what they say about how real this experience was. Watch.
Dr. Mary Neal is an orthopedic surgeon who shares her medical practice and her love for outdoor adventure with her husband, Bill. In 1999, they planned an adventure that took Mary on a spiritual journey few have taken and returned to talk about.
My husband and I really enjoy kayaking. We enjoy traveling. We speak Spanish. We've traveled internationally a number of times. And so for my husband's birthday, I said, okay, this is the year we're going to do it. So we went to Chile for a vacation to kayak.
After a week of kayaking, Bill sat out the final day with a sore back. Mary and the rest of their group kayaked through a treacherous stretch of the river.
These are drops of 10 to 15 feet, 20 feet maybe, which for an experienced kayaker is not a crazy thing. I went over the main drop, and as I crested over the drop, I could see the tremendous turbulence and tremendous volume. And as I hit the bottom of the drop, the front end of my boat became pinned. I and my boat were immediately and completely submerged. I was absolutely pressed to the front deck of the boat, and I couldn't move my arms even back far enough to reach my spray skirt, let alone push myself out. I very sincerely asked that God's will be done, and I meant it.
After several minutes of searching, the group leaders realized Mary was trapped under the falls.
They came out on the rocks and they kept trying to get to the boat, but the force and the volume of the water was such that they just kept being flushed through. I mean, they just couldn't get to me. At one point, they sort of recognized that it was really turning into body recovery, not so much of a rescue. I know I've been underwater too long to be alive, yet I feel more alive than I've ever felt. And this is more real than anything I've ever experienced.
Dr. Neal was dead for 30 minutes. And yet what she said is common. She felt more alive than she's ever felt before. So imagine that time in your life that you dreaded the most when you pass from this life into whatever's next. Imagine you're out of this physical body, but you have a new body. And that's one of the commonalities, that we're out of this body, but we have a new spiritual body. And they say not just with 5 senses, it feels like more like 50 senses. It's the most exhilarating experience that you've ever had. And people say that initially they leave their body, but they remain in the vicinity so they can describe the resuscitation attempts that were happening. And in chapter 2, I write about skeptical doctors that were convinced that this is real because of what people reported that they couldn't have otherwise seen. Like cardiologist Dr. Michael Sabin was one I talked to who didn't believe that near-death experiences were a real thing. He said, before talking with Pete, one of his patients, and scores like him, I didn't believe there was such a thing as a near-death experience. Pete told me he'd left his body during his first cardiac arrest and had watched my resuscitation attempts. When I asked him to tell me exactly what he saw, he described the resuscitation with such detail and accuracy, I could have later used the tape to teach physicians. He said these people like Pete Morton saw the details of the resuscitation they could not otherwise have seen. One patient noticed a physician who failed to wear scuffs over his white shoes during open heart surgery. In many cases, I was able to confirm the patient's testimony with medical records and the hospital staff. And Dr. Sabin studied these for 5 years and then ended up writing a book on why he was convinced it was real and published his findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Dr. Jeff Long, a radiation oncologist, read it there and thought, no, this is BS. Never heard of this, but he started asking his patients. And what you find is, see, people who have had this experience are very hesitant to talk about it because people make fun of it. They think they're crazy, but it's realer than real, if you can imagine that. Jeff Long ends up studying, Dr. Long studies 1,000 of them and says this, by studying thousands of detailed accounts of NDEers, near-death experiencers, I found the evidence that led to this astounding conclusion. NDEs provide such powerful scientific evidence, it's reasonable to accept the existence of an afterlife. And what they found across the globe is reports like in The Lancet, the Europe's most prestigious medical journal. They reported a guy coming into a hospital in Holland. He'd had a cardiac arrest. He was comatose. They're going to shock him. They go to ventilate him and realize that, intubate him, and they realize he had dentures. So the nurse took his dentures out, put it in the lower drawer of a crash cart. They shocked him. His heart started beating, but he never came to an ER. They move him to another room. A week later, he comes to, and he said, I could see everything going on in the ER, even though his eyes were closed the whole time. He was comatose. He described all the nurses and doctors in there, what they did to him, and told them exactly where they could find his lost dentures in the lower drawer of the crash cart where that nurse put them. And these kinds of stories are what led many skeptical doctors to believe there's something real going on here. Now, I believe the Apostle Paul actually had a near-death experience when he got stoned to death in Lystra, stoned to death with rocks. Always have to just make that clear, right? So it's reported in Acts chapter 14. It says this: they stoned Paul and dragged him out of town, thinking he was dead. But as the believers got around him, he got up and went back into town. Now listen to what Paul says later about that experience. He says, I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Why didn't he know? Well, because it feels like ourselves, our real body, but it's a spiritual body. I do know, he says, I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. And Paul goes on to explain that when we die, it's like we get a body upgrade, better than a cell phone upgrade, right? It's like this is version 1.0, we get version 2.0. And by the way, Jesus got version 3.0, but we won't go into that. But Paul talks about it. He says, our bodies are buried in brokenness, 1 Corinthians 15, but they're raised in glory. They're buried in weakness, they're raised in strength. They're buried natural human bodies, but they will be raised spiritual bodies. And I explore this more in Imagine Heaven, but the main thing to know is you're yourself. We're ourselves, we recognize each other. But we have eyesight that is in new dimensions, new scope. We can see miles. Communication is pure, it's thought to thought, heart to heart. And movement is unlimited. We're ourselves, but we experience life in new dimensions. The thing I find is that people have such a horrible view of heaven. I mean, even Christians. We think heaven's going to be boring. We picture it like an endless church service. That sounds boring to me, and I'm a pastor, all right? But that's because everything in this life eventually gets boring and frustrating. You know why? Because this is not the life we were meant for. It's temporary. And this life is really more a shadow of the real life to come. In fact, it says that in Hebrews 8:5, that the tabernacle God had Moses develop or build, says they serve in a system of worship, that tabernacle, that's only a copy, a shadow of the real one in heaven. So if what we experience here is just a shadow of the real life to come, think about the beauty of earth and imagine beauty in new dimensions of time and space, because that's another commonality. So after observing their lifeless body for a little bit, people say they move, and they describe it going through a tunnel or a pathway. They describe it different ways. I kind of wonder if that's like going through a wormhole from our time-space dimensions into God's, multi-dimensional universe. But Paul says this of it. He says, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. And Isaiah saw this, he had a vision of heaven, and the angels were declaring, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. So think about that for a second. Think of the beauty of earth, all the beauty of earth, and how it points to something glorious about God, and yet this creation is wounded, it's marred. It's the messed up version. So why would we think where God lives, creation would be less than this? Romans 8 says, all creation, this earth is waiting eagerly for the future day when God will reveal who his children really are. Against its will, this creation was subjected to God's curse. But with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it'll join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. For we know all creation is groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Earth labors under famine and disease and death and destruction, because it's not the one to hang on to. But there is a real life and a real world, more beautiful, more concrete than this one ever was. Don Piper was a pastor who got run over by an 18-wheeler coming across a bridge, flattened his car, EMS showed up, pronounced him dead. He was dead for 90 minutes while they waited for the jaws of life to cut him out of the wreckage. But he said he was instantly at the gates of heaven. Not everybody goes through a tunnel. And a welcoming committee of friends and relatives came to greet him. And listen to how Don and then Dr. Mary Neal described the beauty of what they saw there.
So take us back to that day
you saw the 18-wheeler come, what was the next memory you had?
Well, I took my last breath on the bridge, and my next breath was at one of the 12 gates of heaven. I'm looking through the gates. I'm looking down the street. There is a river that flows from this throne, or this hill that's high and lifted up, and I know that's the river of life because we're told that it flows from the throne of God. So many of the things that we know and enjoy and love here are visible there as well. I would say this, heaven's never going to be less than this. It's always going to be more.
Yeah.
In heaven, it's all big. I mean, it so far transcends any words that we could come up with here. If you want to talk about meadows and flowers and beauty, and if you want to talk about trees.
Did you see that?
Oh yes, they're just magnificent, except that they are so brilliant and so vivid as to really defy description.
So you live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, one of the most beautiful places on earth. How did that compare to this beautiful path leading to heaven?
One of the problems that I and most people had when they came back from a near-death experience is that even the most intense beauty here on earth, even the most intense love here on earth, is very, very pale in comparison to the intensity of the love and to the intensity of the beauty in God's world. Everything was far more intense. The colors were beyond anything we could ever experience here.
And we get to experience and explore all this beauty together. Because another commonality is the realization heaven is meant for relationship. You know, Jesus said it. He said to love God and love people are the two greatest commandments that sum up the whole Bible. Relationship is what it's all about. And so why would we ever think that God wants to rip relationship apart from us in eternity? It's just the opposite. We'll know each other. We'll recognize each other. We can wear what we wear today. You know, but we also can experience so much more. Jesus said this his last night on earth to his closest friends. He said, there's more than enough room in my Father's home. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And when everything is ready, I'll come to get you so you will always be with me where I am. You know, Marv Besson was a banker who died in a hospital and said he had this welcoming party consisting of friends and relatives. And he said both the friends were prayer warriors. We'd spent many hours praying together. I'm not sure if that's why God chose these two guys for me to see. They were significant to my spiritual life. In fact, everyone I saw had been influential in shaping my life in some way. A woman who died giving birth said this, I recognized my grandmother and a girl I had known when I was in school and many other relatives and friends. It was a very happy occasion. I felt they had come to protect or to guide me. Now, word of warning here, because Mary said many of them said the same thing, that they were there to guide and welcome, but also protect. This welcoming committee was there to protect. And they didn't exactly know what from. And what I realized is that these people are just getting a peek into a vast world, vastly larger than our world. So they're not seeing all there is to see. It's kind of like Mount Rushmore. Everybody's used to seeing this side of Mount Rushmore, but there's another side of Mount Rushmore that people don't often see. It's not that pretty, is it? But here's what's